On the morning of November 9, 1983, inside a concrete bunker 300 meters beneath the Ural Mountains, Colonel General Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov received a telephone call that would force him to choose between obedience and extinction. The red phone rang once. That was all it took. In the Soviet nuclear command structure, a single ring from the red phone meant only one thing: authorization to prepare for strategic launch. 2 rings meant confirmation. 3 rings meant execution. But that morning the protocol shattered. The phone rang once, then stopped. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Once. Then silence. Then again. The pattern made no sense. It violated every drill, every procedure, every war game Volkov had participated in during his 27 years of service. He stared at the receiver, his hand hovering above it, and in that moment of hesitation, the clock of history held its breath. The world did not know his name. It still doesn't. But for 16 minutes on that November morning, Dmitry Volkov held the fate of 300 million people in the space between his doubt and his duty. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about a man who did the one thing the system could never forgive. He thought for himself. And in doing so, he saved a world that would never thank him, because it would never know how close it came to ending. The year 1983 stood as the most dangerous year of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was not hyperbole. This was assessment, cold, calculated, documented in classified memoranda that would not be declassified for another 30 years. The tension had been building like pressure in a sealed vessel. In March, President Ronald Reagan had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, immediately nicknamed Star Wars by a skeptical press. To the Soviet leadership, it was not science fiction. It was a declaration that the United States intended to achieve nuclear superiority and first strike capability. The calculus of mutually assured destruction, which had kept the peace through the logic of suicide, was being deliberately undermined. In September, Korean Airlines Flight 007 strayed into Soviet airspace. A Su-15 interceptor shot it down. 269 people died, including a United States congressman. The Reagan administration called it murder. The Politburo called it defense. Both sides used the word war more frequently in internal communications. In October, the United States invaded Grenada without warning. To Moscow, it was proof that Washington had abandoned diplomatic restraint. And in November, NATO launched Able Archer 83. Able Archer was supposed to be a routine command post exercise, a simulation of NATO's nuclear release procedures in the event of Soviet attack. It was held every year, but Able Archer 83 was different. It was larger. It involved heads of state. It used new, encrypted communication formats that Soviet intelligence could not decode. And for the first time, it simulated the transition from conventional to chemical to nuclear warfare. To NATO commanders, it was a drill. To the KGB, it looked exactly like preparation for a real first strike. Soviet intelligence had received reports, later proven false, that NATO had moved nuclear warheads to forward positions. Satellite imagery, later revealed to be misinterpreted, seemed to show unusual activity at American air bases. Human intelligence from Eastern Europe, much of it planted disinformation, suggested that NATO was preparing to exploit the Soviet leadership transition following Yuri Andropov's declining health. In Moscow, the Politburo convened an emergency session. In Washington, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane would later write in his memoirs that he had no idea how close the world had come. In Brussels, NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Bernard Rogers was conducting a war game. And, in the Ural Mountains, in a bunker designed to survive a direct nuclear strike and continue fighting a war that would leave only ash and silence, Colonel General Dmitry Volkov was on duty. Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov was not supposed to be memorable. In the Soviet system, especially in the strategic rocket forces, being memorable was dangerous. He was 51 years old, with gray hair cut military short, a face that held no distinguishing features, and a record that was exemplary precisely because it contained no initiatives, no creative interpretations, no individual thinking. He had been born in Perm, the son of a factory foreman and a schoolteacher. His father had survived the Great Patriotic War by keeping his head down and following orders. His mother had survived Stalin's purges by never expressing an opinion. Dmitri had learned from both. He had joined the Red Army at 18 during the final years of Stalin's reign. He had been smart enough to be noticed, but not so brilliant as to be threatening. He had been loyal enough to be trusted, but not so fanatical as to be reckless. He had moved through the ranks with the steady, unremarkable progress of a man who understood that survival meant invisibility. By 1983, he commanded a sector of the Soviet nuclear response system. His bunker, officially designated Object 47S, coordinated communication between Moscow and 3 ICBM fields containing a total of 180 SS-18 and SS-19 missiles. Each missile carried multiple warheads. Each warhead was 30 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Volkov's job was simple: receive authorization from Moscow, verify the codes, and relay the launch order to the missile fields. He was a link in a chain. He was not supposed to think. He was supposed to transmit. His wife, Katerina, lived in a military apartment in Chelyabinsk, 60 kilometers from the bunker. They had been married for 28 years. They had 2 children, a son who was an engineer in Leningrad and a daughter who taught mathematics in Moscow. They wrote letters. They visited once or twice a year. The family was normal, functional, distant, like most Soviet families where the father's work was classified. Katerina knew her husband worked in the strategic rocket forces. She did not know where. She did not know what he did. She had learned not to ask. On the rare occasions when Dmitri came home, he was quiet, tired, and careful. He read Pravda. He listened to the radio. He played chess with their neighbor, an old veteran who had lost an arm at Kursk. He never discussed his work. In his personnel file, there was a psychological evaluation conducted in 1978. It noted, "Subject demonstrates appropriate ideological commitment, high stress tolerance, and excellent adherence to protocol. No signs of independent political thought. Suitable for continued service in strategic systems." That evaluation was correct. For 27 years, Dmitri Volkov had been exactly what the system required: obedient, reliable, invisible. Until November 9, 1983. Object 47S was not a place. It was a tomb designed for the living. The bunker had been constructed in the late 1960s, carved into the granite of the Ural Mountains by conscript labor and paranoia. It could withstand a direct nuclear strike of up to 5 megatons. It had its own air filtration system, its own water supply, its own generators. It was designed to function independently for 90 days after a nuclear exchange, continuing to coordinate retaliatory strikes long after the cities above had been reduced to radioactive dust. 300 meters of rock separated the bunker from the surface. The only access was through a single elevator shaft with blast doors weighing 40 tons. Inside, the temperature was kept at a constant 15 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of concrete, oil, and recycled breath. The lighting was fluorescent, constant, timeless. Day and night had no meaning. Shifts were measured by clocks, not by sun. The main command center was a rectangular room 15 meters long and 8 meters wide. One wall was covered with maps showing the Soviet Union, NATO territories, and projected fallout patterns. Another wall held communications equipment, radio transceivers, teletype machines, scrambler phones, and the Red Phone, the direct line to Moscow. A third wall displayed status boards tracking the readiness of the missile fields under Volkov's command. The fourth wall was blank concrete, painted green, stained with decades of cigarette smoke. There were 6 other officers on duty that morning, each responsible for specific subsystems: communication verification, code authentication, targeting confirmation, launch sequence monitoring, damage assessment, and contingency coordination. They sat at metal desks arranged in 2 rows, facing the status boards. They wore olive green uniforms. They drank tea from chipped enamel cups. They smoked cheap cigarettes. They rarely spoke. Volkov's desk was at the rear of the room, elevated slightly so he could observe all stations. On his desk were 3 items: a black telephone connected to the internal bunker system, the red telephone connected to Moscow, and a wooden box containing the authentication codes that would verify any launch order. The codes were changed every 72 hours. Only Volkov and 1 other officer, Major Gregory Suslov, had access to the current codes. Suslov was not on duty that morning. He was at home in Chelyabinsk on his scheduled rest period. This would later become important. The duty shift had begun at 6 o'clock. By 9:30, the routine was as it always was: status reports every 30 minutes. Communication checks every hour. Nothing to report. The overnight shift had logged no alerts, no unusual activity, no changes in readiness status. NATO was conducting Able Archer 83, but that was being monitored at higher command levels. At Object 47S, it was just another morning of waiting for a war that would never come. At 9:47, the red phone rang once. Volkov looked at it. So did every other officer in the room. A single ring was not protocol. Launch authorization followed a specific sequence: first ring to alert, second ring to confirm attention, then verbal communication from Moscow providing code authentication and target package. A single ring meant nothing. It was a test, a mistake, or a malfunction. Volkov waited. 30 seconds later, the red phone rang again. Once. Then, silence. The room was now completely quiet. No one moved. No one spoke. They were trained to wait for orders. They were trained not to improvise. 60 seconds later, the red phone rang a 3rd time. Once. This was wrong. Volkov picked up the receiver. Object 47S, Colonel General Volkov speaking. Authentication required. There was no response. The line was open. He could hear the faint hiss of the secure circuit, but no voice. Then the line went dead. Volkov placed the receiver back on the cradle. His hand was steady, but inside his chest, something cold and sharp had begun to form. Log the event, he said to the communication officer. Time, 0-9-40-7. 3 sequential alert rings from Moscow circuit. No voice contact. Line terminated. The communication officer typed the entry into the log. His fingers were shaking. At 9:51, the red phone rang again. This time it rang continuously, not in the patterned sequence of protocol, but in a sustained, urgent tone that filled the command center like an alarm. Volkov picked up immediately. Object 47S, Colonel General Volkov speaking. Authentication required. This time there was a voice. It was distorted, compressed by the encryption system, but recognizable as belonging to General Lieutenant Anatoly Grigorenko, Deputy Chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces Command in Moscow. Volkov, prepare to receive authorization code Zhukov 7. Acknowledge. Volkov's training took over. His voice was calm, mechanical. Acknowledged. Standing by for authentication. Authorization code Zhukov 7. Echo. Foxtrot. Delta. November. Authenticate and prepare launch sequence per protocol Zaslin 3. Target package follows. Acknowledge. Volkov opened the wooden box on his desk and removed the authentication book, a red folder containing the current week's code sequences. He found the page for November 9th. His eyes scanned the codes. There was no code sequence Zhukov 7. Zhukov 6 existed. Zhukov Fate existed. But Zhukov 7 had been retired in August after a security review. It was no longer valid. Moscow, this is Object 47's. Code Zhukov 7 does not authenticate. Repeat, code does not authenticate. Request verification. There was a pause. Then Grigorenko's voice returned, and now there was something different in it. Not anger, but urgency, laced with something Volkov could not identify. Volkov, this is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. NATO forces have initiated first strike protocol. Impact estimates 17 minutes. You are ordered to authenticate Zhukov 7 and execute Zaslin 3 immediately. Acknowledge. Every officer in the command center was now staring at Volkov. They had heard the transmission. They knew what it meant. Zaslin 3 was full retaliatory launch. Everything. All missiles. All targets. The end of the world in technical language. Volkov looked at the authentication book again. The code was still wrong. Moscow, I repeat, Zhukov 7 does not authenticate per current authorization matrix. I cannot execute without valid authentication. Request you transmit valid code. The pause was longer this time. Then Grigorenko's voice came back, and now there was no mistaking the edge in it. Volkov, there is no time for this. The code is valid. You are experiencing communication interference from NATO jamming. Authenticate manually and execute. This is a direct order from Strategic Command. Acknowledge immediately. Volkov's mouth was dry. His heart was beating faster, but his hands remained steady. He was trained for this moment. Every officer in the Strategic Rocket Forces was trained for this moment. The scenario was clear. NATO launches first strike. Soviet sensors detect incoming missiles. Moscow orders immediate retaliation before the missiles destroy Soviet command and control. Speed is everything. Hesitation is treason. But the code was wrong. And there was something else wrong. Something he could not articulate but could feel like a frequency just below the range of hearing. Moscow, I require confirmation from alternate authority. Request connection to General Kozlov. Kozlov was the chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces, Grigorenko's superior. Kozlov is unavailable. I am acting command authority. You are ordered to execute. Volkov, if you do not comply, you will be held responsible for failure to defend the motherland. Do you understand what that means? Volkov understood exactly what that meant. It meant a firing squad. But he also understood something else. In 27 years of service, he had never heard a launch order delivered with this kind of emotion. Real launch orders, in every drill he had ever participated in, were cold, precise, and followed exact protocol. They were mechanical because they had to be. Emotion could cause mistakes, and mistakes in nuclear war meant launching at the wrong target or failing to launch when necessary. This conversation felt human. It felt urgent. It felt wrong. Moscow, I cannot execute without valid authentication code. I am prepared to face consequences of this decision. Please verify code through alternate channel and retransmit. Object 47 is standing by. There was a long silence. Then the line went dead again. The command center was frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. At 9:58, the black phone on Volkov's desk rang. The internal bunker line. He picked it up. Yes. Comrade General, this is Lieutenant Baranov at Communications. I have Major Suslov on the external line. He says it's urgent. Should I transfer? Suslov? The other officer with access to the authentication codes. He was supposed to be at home, off duty. Why was he calling? Transfer him. There was a click, and then Suslov's voice, breathless and frightened. Dmitri, listen to me carefully. Do not execute anything. I'm at district headquarters. There's chaos here. No one knows what's happening. But I just spoke to Colonel Petrov in Moscow, and he says there's been no NATO attack. Able Archer is still ongoing, but it's a drill. Just a drill. Something is wrong with the command circuit. There's confusion, but there's no attack. Volkov's grip on the receiver tightened. Gregory, I received a direct order from General Grigorenko to execute Zaslin 3. He said NATO has launched. Dmitri, I'm telling you, Petrov says there's no attack. The early warning system shows nothing. Radar shows nothing. Someone gave an order that shouldn't have been given, or there's a communication breakdown, or Suslov's voice dropped to a whisper, or someone in Moscow panicked. Volkov closed his eyes. The world narrowed to a single point, a decision. If NATO had really launched, he had perhaps 15 minutes before Soviet command and control was destroyed. 15 minutes to retaliate, to ensure that even in death, the Soviet Union would drag its enemy into the grave. 15 minutes in which hesitation was betrayal and thought was treason. But if NATO had not launched, if this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a false alarm, then executing Zazulin III meant starting a nuclear war. It meant killing millions of people for no reason. It meant ending civilization because of confusion. One decision, two possibilities. No time to verify. This was the moment that Colonel General Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov, a man who had spent his entire career being invisible, stepped into the light. Gregory, I'm not executing. Log the time, 1000 hours, November 9th, 1983. I am refusing a launch order on grounds of authentication failure and contradictory intelligence. If I'm wrong, I'll face the consequences. If I'm right, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Understood, Suslov said quietly. I'll document everything from here. Good luck, Dmitri. The line went dead. Volkov turned to face the command center. 6 officers stared at him. They had heard everything. They were witnesses. Gentlemen, Volkov said, his voice steady, we are standing down. No launch. We will maintain defensive posture and await clarification from Moscow. If I have made an error, the responsibility is mine alone. You are to log that you followed my orders. Understood? They nodded one by one, and they waited. At 10:17, the red phone rang again. Volkov picked up. This time it was not Grigorenko. It was General Kozlov himself, the chief of strategic rocket forces. Volkov. The voice was cold, controlled, and utterly exhausted. Stand down all alert protocols. There has been no NATO attack. Able Archer was misinterpreted. There was a communication error in the alert system. You will file a full report. You will speak to no one about this. Do you understand? Yes, Comrade General. Volkov. Kozlov paused. You did not execute. No, Comrade General. The authentication code did not verify. Another pause, longer this time. Report to Moscow within 72 hours. Bring all logs. Yes, Comrade General. The line went dead. Volkov sat down at his desk. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining away, leaving only the vast, cold understanding of what had almost happened. If he had obeyed, the missiles would have launched. NATO would have detected them. NATO would have launched in response. Within 30 minutes, 3,000 nuclear warheads would have been in flight. Within an hour, every major city in the northern hemisphere would have been burning. Within a week, the radiation and ash would have spread across the planet. Within a year, billions would have died, because of a misunderstanding, because of confusion, because someone, somewhere in the chain of command had panicked, and he had refused. He looked at the authentication book still open on his desk, at the code that didn't exist, and he thought, this is what saves us. Not loyalty, not courage, just doubt, just a man who hesitated. One of the officers, Lieutenant Baranov, approached his desk carefully, as if approaching something fragile and dangerous. Comrade General, what do we write in the log? Volkov thought for a moment. Then he said very quietly, the truth. The flight from Chelyabinsk to Moscow took 3 hours. Volkov sat in the rear of the military transport, alone except for a young lieutenant who had been assigned as his escort. The lieutenant did not speak. He had been given orders, and those orders clearly did not include conversation. Through the small window, Volkov watched the landscape pass below. Forests, rivers, towns that looked like clusters of gray boxes, and roads that stretched to nowhere. It was November, and snow had already covered much of the land. From this height, the Soviet Union looked peaceful, orderly, eternal. It did not look like something that had almost ended 3 days ago. Volkov had spent those 3 days at Object 47S filing reports. He had documented every second of the incident, the irregular phone rings, the incorrect authentication code, the conversation with Grigorenko, the call from Suslov, his decision not to execute. He had included statements from every officer on duty. He had attached communication logs, code verification records, and timeline analysis. The report was 147 pages long. It was the most dangerous document he had ever written. Because buried in those pages was a simple, unavoidable truth: the system had failed. The chain of command, the protocols, the safeguards, all of it had broken down. And the only thing that had prevented a nuclear war was one man's refusal to follow orders. In a system built on absolute obedience, that was not heroism, that was heresy. Katerina had visited him once during those 3 days, bringing food and clean clothes. She had looked at him with the expression of someone watching a loved one disappear into a distance she could not follow. She had not asked what happened, she knew better. But before she left, she had held his hand and said something she had never said before. "Whatever you did, Dmitri, I know it was right." He had not answered. He did not know if she was right. All he knew was that hundreds of millions of people were still alive, and they would never know why. The transport landed at a military airfield outside Moscow at 14:30 on November 12th. A black Volga sedan was waiting. The driver, a sergeant with the blank face of state security, opened the rear door without speaking. Volkov got in. They drove into Moscow through streets that looked the same as always: gray buildings, red banners, people in heavy coats moving with purpose toward destinations they could not choose. Volkov had been born in the Soviet Union. He had lived his entire life under its logic. But now, looking out at the city, he felt like a foreigner observing a place he had never truly understood. The car stopped in front of a building on Frunzensky Embankment. It was not the Ministry of Defense. It was not the General Staff Headquarters. It was an anonymous concrete structure with no signs, no guards visible at the entrance, and windows that reflected the gray sky like blind eyes. This was a KGB facility. The sergeant opened the door. 4th floor. Room 417. Volkov stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the Volga pulled away immediately, as if contaminated by association. Inside, the building smelled of disinfectant and old paperwork. The corridors were narrow, painted institutional green, lit by bare bulbs. Volkov's footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor. There were doors on both sides, all closed, all numbered. From somewhere distant came the sound of a typewriter, then silence. He found room 417. The door was open. Inside was a small office with a metal desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and nothing else. No pictures, no books, no windows. A man sat behind the desk. He wore a civilian suit, gray and inexpensive. He was perhaps 45, with thinning hair and the kind of face that was designed to be forgotten 5 minutes after you saw it. Colonel General Volkov. "Sit down." Volkov sat. The man opened a folder and read for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked up. "My name is not important. I represent a committee that has been tasked with reviewing the events of November 9th. Your report has been studied. You refused to execute a launch order from a superior officer. You understand this is a serious matter. Yes. Why did you refuse? The authentication code was invalid. General Lieutenant Grigorenko ordered you to authenticate manually and execute. You refused his direct order. Why? Because the code was invalid according to current protocol, and without valid authentication, I could not verify the order's legitimacy." The man leaned back in his chair. "You are aware that during a nuclear attack, communication systems may be damaged or disrupted. Protocols exist for manual authentication in such circumstances. You were trained in these protocols, yet you did not use them. Why?" Volkov considered lying. Then he realized it would be pointless. These people already knew everything. They were not seeking information. They were testing him. Because something felt wrong. Felt. The man repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "You made a decision that could have resulted in the destruction of the Soviet Union based on a feeling?" "No. I made a decision based on contradictory information, protocol violation, and my assessment that the order was not legitimate." "Your assessment." The man closed the folder. "Colonel General Volkov, you are a component in a system. That system is designed to function even under conditions of extreme stress and partial information. When the component begins making independent assessments, the system fails. Do you understand this? Yes. Do you understand that your refusal to execute, had there been a real attack, would have constituted treason? Yes. Do you understand that approximately 16 minutes passed between the initial alert and General Kozlov's stand-down order? Do you understand that if NATO missiles had been launched, those 16 minutes would have been the window in which Soviet retaliation was still possible? Do you understand that your hesitation could have meant that Moscow was destroyed without consequence to the enemy? Yes. The man opened a different folder. This one contained a single sheet of paper. He read from it. Psychological Evaluation, 1978. Quote, subject demonstrates appropriate ideological commitment, high stress tolerance, and excellent adherence to protocol. No signs of independent political thought, end quote. He looked up. That evaluation appears to have been incorrect. Volkov said nothing. You have served for 27 years without incident. Your record is exemplary. You have never questioned an order. You have never deviated from protocol. And then, on November 9th, you made a decision that violated everything you had been trained to do. The question we are attempting to answer is, why? I told you. The authentication code was invalid. And if the code had been valid, if it had been a simple transmission error that made Zhukov 7 sound like an invalid code, would you still have executed? Volkov met the man's eyes. I don't know. That is the wrong answer, Colonel General. The correct answer is yes, without hesitation. That is what the system requires. That is what your oath requires. That is what your uniform requires. But you don't know. The man's voice was soft now, almost sympathetic. This is the problem with human components. They think, they doubt, they feel. He closed the folder and stood up. You will be placed on administrative leave pending completion of the review. You will not return to Object 47s. You will not discuss the events of November 9th with anyone, including your family. You will remain in Moscow at a location that will be provided to you. You will be available for further questioning. Do you understand? Yes. You are dismissed. Volkov stood and turned toward the door. Colonel General, the man's voice stopped him. There is something you should know. General Lieutenant Grigorenko has been removed from his position. He is also under review. The communication system that failed on November 9th is being investigated. Several officers in the alert chain are being questioned. There is a great deal of confusion about what actually happened that morning. Volkov turned back. What did happen? The man smiled, and it was the saddest smile Volkov had ever seen. We don't know. That is the terrifying truth. We have the most sophisticated nuclear command system ever built, designed by brilliant minds, tested in countless drills. And on November 9th, it did something no one understands. It generated an alert that should not have been possible. It transmitted an invalid code. It created the impression of an attack that did not exist. And the only reason we did not launch is because one man refused to obey. He paused. The system sees this as a failure. But I wonder if it was actually a success. I don't understand. Neither do I, Colonel General. Neither do I. You may go. The location provided to Volkov was a small apartment in the Kuntsevo district. On the 8th floor of a building that looked like every other building in Moscow, concrete, functional, gray. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and furniture that seemed to have been requisitioned from a prison. Minimal, hard, designed for endurance rather than comfort. There was no telephone. There was no television. There was a radio, but it received only official channels. Volkov had been told he would remain here until the review was complete. He had not been told how long that would take, days, weeks, months, in the Soviet system. Administrative review was a process that could stretch into infinity, especially when the alternative was admitting that the system itself was flawed. He spent the first day arranging his belongings. He had brought little from Chelyabinsk: clothes, a few books, his chess set. He had left everything else with Katerina. He did not know if he would see her again. Administrative leave could mean many things. Sometimes it meant nothing, just bureaucracy working slowly. Sometimes it meant disgrace. Sometimes it meant worse. On the second day, he tried to establish a routine. He woke at 6 o'clock as he always had. He exercised. He ate breakfast. He read. He played chess against himself, setting up problems from books and working through solutions. He tried not to think about what was happening in the rooms where decisions were being made. On the third day, he began to understand what exile felt like. The apartment had a window that looked out over other identical buildings. Volkov would stand there for hours, watching people move through the courtyard below. Mothers with children. Old men walking dogs. Teenagers smoking cigarettes where they thought no one could see. Normal life, ordinary existence. Everything he had saved and everything that would never know he existed. There was a knock on his door on the 5th day. Volkov opened it to find a young woman in civilian clothes carrying a briefcase. She had dark hair pulled back severely, glasses, and the cautious expression of someone who had been sent on an uncomfortable errand. "Colonel General Volkov? I am Dr. Antonina Sokolova. I have been assigned to conduct a psychological evaluation. May I come in?" He stepped aside. They sat at the small table in the kitchen. Dr. Sokolova removed a notepad and pen from her briefcase, then looked at him with professional sympathy. "I want to assure you that this conversation is confidential. I am here to assess your mental state, not to make judgments about your actions. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Let's begin. How are you sleeping?" "Well enough. Are you experiencing anxiety? Flashbacks to the events of November 9th? No. No nightmares? No." She made a note. "Colonel General, you made a decision under extreme pressure that went against your training and orders. It's natural to experience psychological stress afterward. There's no shame in admitting that. I'm not experiencing stress. Are you thinking about what might have happened if you had made a different choice?" Volkov looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Every day, every hour, every minute." She nodded, as if this was the first honest thing he had said. "Tell me what you think about." "I think about the fact that if I had obeyed, there would be no one left to have this conversation. I think about the fact that millions of people are alive because of a communication error and my doubt. I think about the fact that the system I served my entire life is designed so perfectly that it almost killed everyone." He paused. "And I think about the fact that next time, the man in my position might obey." "Next time? You'd think November 9th was unique? You'd think that kind of confusion, that kind of breakdown can only happen once?" Volkov leaned forward. "Dr. Sokolova, I spent 27 years in the Strategic Rocket Forces. I participated in dozens of drills. And every single drill had small errors, small miscommunications, small moments of confusion. We fixed them afterward. We updated protocols. We learned, but we were always one step behind reality. The system is too complex, the decisions are too fast, the stakes are too high. November 9th wasn't an aberration. It was inevitable." Dr. Sokolova was writing quickly now. "So you believe another incident like this will occur?" "I believe we got lucky. I believe luck runs out." "Do you regret your decision?" "No." "Do you believe you were right to disobey?" "I believe hundreds of millions of people are still breathing. Whether that makes me right or wrong is not my judgment to make." She closed her notepad. "Colonel General, I'm going to recommend that you receive ongoing psychological support. What you experienced was traumatic, and your response, while intellectually coherent, suggests a level of existential anxiety that could affect your well-being." Volkov almost laughed. "Doctor, with respect, I don't have existential anxiety. I have existential clarity. I know exactly how fragile everything is." "Most people don't. That's not a disorder. That's just knowledge." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Colonel General, I think you saved the world. But I also think the world will never forgive you for it." After she left, Volkov returned to the window and watched the courtyard below, where children were playing in the snow, building formless shapes that would melt by morning. The review concluded on December 18, 1983. Volkov was summoned back to the building on Frunzinskaya Embankment, to the same office, to face the same forgettable man behind the same metal desk, Colonel General Volkov. The committee has completed its investigation. You are hereby retired from active service in the Strategic Rocket Forces, effective immediately. You will receive full pension. You will retain your rank for honorific purposes. You will not be subject to criminal prosecution. However, you are permanently barred from any position involving classified information or state security. Do you understand? Yes. You are also reminded that the events of November 9th remain classified at the highest level. You are forbidden from discussing them with any person, under any circumstances, for any reason. Violation of this order will result in immediate prosecution for disclosure of state secrets. Do you understand? Yes. You are dismissed. That was all. No explanation. No acknowledgement, no gratitude. Just retirement at 51 with a pension and silence. Volkov stood. May I ask a question? The man looked up, surprised. You may ask, what was the conclusion? What caused the alert? The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Volkov suspected was true, even though it would never appear in any official record. We don't know. The system did something we cannot explain. Perhaps a software error. Perhaps a hardware failure. Perhaps human error at some point in the chain. Perhaps all of these things at once. We have made corrections. We have updated protocols. We have increased redundancy. But ultimately, Colonel General, we do not know. And that terrifies us more than the possibility of war. Volkov nodded slowly. Then it will happen again, perhaps. Or perhaps we will be lucky again, and there will be another man like you who hesitates at the right moment. The man closed the folder on his desk with an air of finality. But we cannot build a system that depends on individual conscience. The system must be obeyed, or it is not a system. You understand the paradox? Yes. The system requires absolute obedience, but absolute obedience would have ended the world. Exactly. That is why you are being retired. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right for the wrong reasons. And we cannot tolerate that. Dmitry Volkov returned to Chelyabinsk on December 20th, 1983. Katerina met him at the train station. She looked older than he remembered. Or perhaps he was simply seeing her with new eyes. The eyes of someone who had looked into the abyss and discovered it was made of confusion and luck. They did not speak on the drive home. What was there to say? He could not tell her what happened. She could not ask. The space between them was filled with secrets and silence, like most Soviet marriages, like most Soviet lives. At home, he unpacked his belongings and tried to imagine what retired life would look like. He was 51 years old. He had no hobbies beyond chess. He had no friends beyond military colleagues he was now forbidden from contacting. He had no purpose beyond the purpose that had just been taken away. He was a man who had saved the world and been erased for it. Over the following months, Volkov established a new routine. He woke at 6 o'clock. He read newspapers. He played chess at a local club where old men gathered to pass time disguised as competition. He took walks through the industrial streets of Chelyabinsk, past factories that produced steel and concrete and pollution, past apartment blocks that looked like filing cabinets for human beings, past schools where children learned the official version of everything. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he had done. To the world, he was just another retired military officer with too much time and not enough purpose. His son visited once, in the spring of 1984. They sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and talked about nothing important. The son's work, the weather, the sorry state of Leningrad's football team. The son left after 2 days. Volkov understood. There was a distance now, a sense that his father had become someone unfamiliar, someone who carried an invisible weight. His daughter wrote letters but never visited. She was busy with her teaching position, with her own life in Moscow, with the future. Volkov did not resent this. He understood that the young must move forward, and the old must simply wait. Katerina remained. She cooked. She cleaned. She maintained the apartment with the efficiency of someone performing a duty. They spoke about groceries and repairs and the neighbor's noise. They did not speak about November 9th. They did not speak about the fact that her husband had become a ghost in his own life. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear plant exploded, spreading radiation across Europe and panic across the Soviet Union. Volkov watched the news reports with a strange sense of recognition. Another system failure. Another moment when human error and complex technology met with catastrophic results. Another reminder that civilization balanced on a knife's edge, held there by nothing more substantial than luck and the occasional courage of someone who refused to obey. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Volkov watched on television as crowds tore apart the symbol of the Cold War with hammers and bare hands, dancing and crying and celebrating. He felt nothing. The wall had been real, but the fear had been more real. And the fear was still there, buried in missile silos and bunkers and the hearts of men who had lived too long in the shadow of extinction. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Volkov watched as the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor of Russia. He watched as the system he had served his entire life simply ended. Not with an explosion or a war or a revolution, but with exhaustion, bankruptcy, and the quiet admission that the grand experiment had failed. And he thought, we almost destroyed the world defending something that was already dead. By the mid-1990s, Volkov was 63 years old, living on a pension that inflation had rendered nearly worthless. The Russia of Yeltsin was chaotic, corrupt, confusing, but it was also free in ways the Soviet Union had never been. People spoke openly. They criticized the government. They asked questions. And yet Volkov never spoke. He never told anyone what had happened on November 9, 1983. He had given his oath of silence. And even though the system that had demanded it no longer existed, the oath remained, because some secrets were not about protecting the state. They were about protecting people from the knowledge of how close they had come to non-existence. Katerina died in 1998, quietly, of heart failure. Volkov buried her in a cemetery on the outskirts of Chelyabinsk, under a simple stone that gave her name and dates and nothing else. At the funeral, he stood alone. Their son had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Their daughter had moved to Germany and sent a telegram expressing regret that she could not attend. Volkov was 70 years old. And he was the last person alive who truly understood what had happened that November morning 15 years earlier. In 2006, a young researcher named Alexei Petrov was working in the archives of the Russian Federation Military History Institute when he came across a reference to a classified file designated Object 47S Incident Report. November 1983. The description was minimal. Alert protocol deviation during NATO exercise Able Archer 83. Resolution, administrative review. No action required. Petrov requested access. He was denied. He requested again. Citing the Freedom of Information Act that had been passed in the hopeful days of the early 1990s, he was denied again. He filed an appeal. 6 months later, he received a letter stating that the file remained classified under national security provisions and would not be released for at least another 50 years. Petrov, frustrated but persistent, began interviewing former Strategic Rocket Forces officers who had served during the 1980s. Most knew nothing. Some remembered rumors of a near-miss during Able Archer, but details were vague, contradictory, impossible to verify. Then by chance he spoke to a retired major named Gregory Suslov, who lived in a small apartment in Moscow and spent his days feeding pigeons in Gorky Park. "You want to know about November 9th?" Suslov asked, his eyes distant with memory. There was a man, Volkov. Dmitry Volkov. He was the duty officer at Object 47S. Something happened that day. I don't know what, but afterward Volkov disappeared. Not arrested, not executed, just retired. I tried to find him once, years later, but there was no record. It was as if he'd never existed. Do you know if he's still alive? I have no idea. He'd be in his 70s now if he is. But men like that, men who know too much, they tend to die quietly. Petrov searched for Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov through public records, military databases, pension registries. He found nothing. The name appeared in military rosters until 1983, then vanished. No death certificate, no current address, nothing. It was as if the man had been erased. Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov died on March 3, 2007, in Chelyabinsk, at the age of 74. He died alone in his apartment, of natural causes. Heart failure, the death certificate said. Though the more accurate diagnosis would have been exhaustion. There was no funeral. His daughter, contacted by the building superintendent, arranged for cremation by telephone from Germany. She did not come to collect the ashes. She did not want them. The apartment was cleared by the state. His belongings, a few clothes, some books, the chess set, were sold or discarded. The apartment was repainted and rented to a young family who knew nothing of the old man who had lived there before them. Among his possessions, the cleaning crew found a wooden box. Inside was a single document, a copy of the authentication codebook from November 9, 1983. On the page for that date, someone, presumably Volkov, had written in neat handwriting, "Zhukov 7 does not exist. I did not execute. May God forgive me if I was wrong." The cleaning crew threw it away. No one ever knew that the man who had saved the world from nuclear annihilation had lived and died in apartment 8B, Kuntsevo Street, Chelyabinsk. No one ever knew that he spent his final years replaying a single moment of doubt, wondering if he had been a hero or a coward, a savior or a traitor. No one ever knew, because no one ever asked. The story of November 9, 1983, remains classified. Historians know that something happened during Able Archer 83, that Soviet forces were placed on high alert, that the Politburo believed NATO might launch a first strike, that the world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the details remain locked in files that will not be opened for decades, if ever. And even when they are opened, they will tell only part of the truth. They will describe communication failures and protocol deviations and administrative responses. They will not mention the red phone that rang incorrectly, the authentication code that did not exist, or the 16 minutes when one man's doubt stood between civilization and extinction. They will not mention Dmitry Volkov because systems do not commemorate the people who expose their failures. The Cold War was not won by generals or politicians or weapons. It was survived by people like Dmitry Volkov, ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary situations who made decisions they were never supposed to make. He was not the only one. History has recorded a few others. Stanislav Petrov, who in 1983 ignored satellite warnings of an American missile launch that turned out to be a computer error. Vasily Arkhipov, who in 1962 refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dozens of others whose names remain classified or forgotten. These men shared something in common. They disobeyed. They hesitated. They doubted. And in doing so, they prevented the end of the world. The irony is profound. The nuclear deterrent system was built on the principle of absolute certainty. The enemy must believe that. Retaliation is automatic, mechanical, inevitable. But in practice, the system survived because of human uncertainty, the moment of doubt, the question asked, the order refused. We built machines designed to function without thought, and we survived because men thought anyway. Dmitry Volkov understood this paradox. In his final years, during the long afternoons when he sat by the window watching snow fall on Chelyabinsk, he often thought about what he would say if anyone ever asked him about November 9th. He would say, "The system is perfect until it isn't. The orders are absolute until they're wrong. The truth is certain until you look closely." And in that gap between certainty and doubt, that tiny space where thought happens, that's where humanity lives. That's where we survive. He would say, "I didn't save the world. I just refused to end it." There's a difference. But no one ever asked. And so those words died with him, unspoken, joining the countless other truths buried in the silence of history. Today, the bunker designated Object 47S still exists, 300 meters beneath the Ural Mountains. It was decommissioned in 2001, part of the arms reduction treaties that followed the Cold War. The elevator shaft has been sealed. The blast doors have been locked. The communications equipment has been removed. But the room remains, empty and dark, waiting for a war that never came. On the wall, barely visible in the dust, someone once wrote in pencil, November 9, 1983. "We did not launch. DV, no one will ever read it." And perhaps that's fitting, because the greatest heroes are the ones who prevent disasters that never happen, who save lives that never know they were in danger, who make sacrifices that no one ever sees. They are the invisible guardians of the world that continues to exist. They are men like Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov, who hesitated for 16 minutes and gave humanity another day, another year, another chance. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile our existence truly was during those tense decades, consider subscribing. The Cold War is over, but its lessons remain. Lessons about systems and humanity, about obedience and conscience, about the thin line between survival and catastrophe. There are many more stories buried in classified files and forgotten memories, stories of ordinary people who faced impossible choices in the shadow of the mushroom cloud. These stories deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered, because the men and women who saved us never asked for recognition. They simply did what they believed was right, even when the world told them it was wrong. Thank you for listening. The truth is always worth preserving, even when it lives in silence.